That's exactly the trap that the Russians are trying to set for Zelensky by basically not going ahead with the ceasefire, but then making an offer of talks, setting up a situation where Zelensky rejects it. That could lead Zelensky to a situation where he's under fire from Trump once again for being the source of the problem. And that would also obstruct and derail any U.S. acquiescence to significant new sanctions on Russia. The Germans, the French, the British are open to imposing sanctions on the banking sector, the shadow fleet, the energy sector that are much tighter if the Russians continue to hold that peace. But without U.S. enforcement, those sanctions become quite limited in value and probably wouldn't influence the conduct of Russian companies or their main clients like China and India.
Now, at a meeting in Kyiv yesterday, European leaders urged Russia to agree a 30-day ceasefire. Keir Starmer threw down the gauntlet to Vladimir Putin at a press conference with his counterparts.
If he's serious about peace, then he has a chance to show it now by extending the V-Day pause into a full, unconditional 30-day ceasefire, with negotiations to follow immediately once a ceasefire is agreed. No more ifs and buts, no more conditions and delays. Putin didn't need conditions when he wanted a ceasefire to have a parade, and he doesn't need them now.
Well, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev posted on social media yesterday. He said Macron, Merz, Starmer and Tusk were supposed to discuss peace in Kyiv. Instead, they're blurting out threats against Russia. Either a truce for the respite of Banderite hordes or new sanctions. You think that's smart? Shove these peace plans up your pan-gender. Well, I'll leave you to fill in the blanks. But it's not safe to repeat that word in the radio. But it's an extraordinary 2 a.m. press conference, though. President Putin struck a very different note.
We propose to start immediately on Thursday, the 15th of May, in Istanbul, the venue that held those talks before. Tomorrow, a phone conversation is planned with the Turkish President Erdogan, and I will ask him to provide the opportunity to hold talks in Turkey. I really hope he will confirm his desire to facilitate peace in Ukraine. We're committed to holding serious talks with Ukraine in order to eliminate the root causes of the conflict, to arrive at an enduring, long-lasting peace.
Well, joining us now is Samuel Ramani, author of Putin's War in Ukraine. Samuel, good afternoon.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Samuel, it seems to be that President Putin has declined that 30-day peace ceasefire, kicking off on Monday, tomorrow, but he's declined it without saying the word no. He's declined it by putting a counter-offer, if you like, on the table.
But that's the classic way in which Russia obstructs diplomacy. They never really say that they're not interested in peace, but they basically create a setup that makes it look like the other party is less interested in peace than them. So what they're doing is they're basically well aware of the fact that the Ukrainians and the Europeans say that a 30-day ceasefire is required for talks. But they try to overlook that and then offer talks. And then if Ukraine or Europe doesn't join or participate in those talks because there's no ceasefire, then they can claim that the Ukrainians, at the behest of the British and the Europeans, are obstructing this, and that's why we have to continue the war.
We've had Chancellor Merz has been posting on X. He says Russia's willingness to talk is a good sign, but he says European leaders expect Moscow to agree to a ceasefire. First, the guns must fall silent before talks can begin. Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk, with a similar message, says Ukraine is ready, no more victims. However, he insists that Russians have proposed peace talks starting 15th of May. The world, however, is waiting for a univocal decision on an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. Are we at a stage now where it's who's going to blink first? And President Zelensky has got a tricky 24 hours ahead of him because he's not seen to be agreeing to these proposed ceasefire, peace talks, I should say, on Thursday. He may be accused from someone like Donald Trump of actually not facilitating the peace talks.
That's exactly the trap that the Russians are trying to set for Zelensky by basically not going ahead with the ceasefire, but then making an offer of talks, setting up a situation where Zelensky rejects it. That could lead Zelensky to a situation where he's under fire from Trump once again for being the source of the problem. And that would also obstruct and derail any U.S. acquiescence to significant new sanctions on Russia. The Germans, the French, the British are open to imposing sanctions on the banking sector, the shadow fleet, the energy sector that are much tighter if the Russians continue to hold that peace. But without U.S. enforcement, those sanctions become quite limited in value and probably wouldn't influence the conduct of Russian companies or their main clients like China and India. So I think that, yes, the Russians are setting up Zelensky for some kind of an unfortunate trap. Another thing we should watch out for is the Russians potentially proposing or reviving the Keith Kellogg proposal for a 30-kilometer demilitarized zone as an alternative to a ceasefire. That's something that Zelensky has also ruled out because that would effectively mean that Ukraine has to walk out of Kherson unilaterally with the possibility of maybe never being able to get that back.
Samuel, do you think this unusual, let's put it that way, statement from President Putin at 2 a.m. in the morning, was it brought about because of the threat of those sanctions from the coalition of the willing, they've named themselves, or do you think it was a preemptive move, if you like, so that he's not going to be accused by Donald Trump of not really wanting peace? We saw that post from Donald Trump a couple of weeks ago. I mean, Russia is not struggling financially. Its economy is actually growing. Perhaps also because of the war production. We hear stories of munitions factories being open 24/7. Is he backed into a corner or is he playing politics?
Well, I don't think that he's being backed into a corner by the Europeans because he's well aware that if he can create a situation where Ukraine is looking like the obstructionist, the Americans aren't going to go along necessarily with those sanctions. And the Russians' narrative throughout the past 3 years is that they are able to sanctions-proof their economy and withstand them. And these new sanctions would probably affect their long-term military supply chains or long-term economic prosperity beyond 2025, so next year and the year after, rather than right now. So that's why I think that he is trying to kind of rewrite the narrative and trying to show that he is sincere and that he's interested in peace. And if the peace talks don't happen, he's able to find someone else to blame. It's a bit unusual, however, for Vladimir Putin to make a nighttime address with a message of de-escalation, because previously when he's made addresses to the nation, we've seen escalations like the partial mobilization or using the nuclear warnings or even starting the special military operation itself. Maybe there's also another factor at play here too. We don't know the exact content of what Chinese President Xi Jinping conveyed to the Russians, and China's worried a lot more about secondary sanctions. China's also concerned about how their support for Russia might impact the trade talks that are going on with the United States, and also the possibility of getting a CAI agreement with Europe. That might also have been a reason or an encouragement for Putin to speak out to appease the Chinese.
Do you see a place where both Ukraine and Russia can agree peace talks? Because so far, when we look at what these peace talks may entail, it very much comes down to Ukraine agreeing to roughly 20% of their territory being kept by Russia, in effect. What is Russia going to be giving up?
Well, that's exactly what the baseline would be if they did revive the peace talks in Istanbul on the 15th of May. Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov, who was with Steve Witkoff alongside him at the meeting, he's a very good spokesperson for Putin. He said that we'd go back to the 2022 Istanbul requirements, which would basically mean that Russia keeps all the territory that it de facto held with Minsk II, so Crimea and most of Donbass, and also territory that's been held since then. So effectively, it does mean a surrender of territory as a precondition for engaging in talks. Also would mean a surrender of NATO membership for Ukraine and any possibility of getting that, which the Ukrainians have already probably tacitly agreed to, even if they won't say it publicly, and maybe even restrictions on Ukraine's long-term military capacity. So I don't think that the Russians are in any mood to make any concessions at all. They're hoping that Ukraine makes unilateral concessions under the pressure from the United States, and their approach to these talks is very much as maximalist as it's ever been.
Do you think that we are going to hear the rest of the day, the course of today, do you think we're going to hear anything more from Russia? It seems that they have put their counter offer on the table and are saying, well, it's this or nothing. Do you think there's any chance that President Putin is going to agree to this 30-day ceasefire beginning tomorrow?
Well, I think it's unlikely that he's going to agree to it. And even if he did agree to a ceasefire, it's important to keep in mind that they may not actually be enforced on the ground. That we saw this with the May 9th ceasefire, for example, of 2 days. There were glide bombs that were hitting Sumy. And also there's lots of sites like the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant or cross-border attacks on refineries where there's fires breaking out in Russia that the Russians would blame on the Ukrainians if they happened. So I think that it's unlikely he will announce a ceasefire, and even if he did make some kind of a gesture in that direction, that doesn't necessarily mean that hostilities on the ground are going to come to a cessation. Because even the May 9th two-day one did not lead to a cessation of hostilities.
And do you think that that will automatically bring on these sanctions that have been threatened over the weekend?
Will likely lead to the ratification of that 17th package of sanctions. The big question is whether it will be able to get unanimity from the EU member states. I mean, certainly we're seeing much stronger statements coming out of Hungary, with Peter Szijjártó basically talking about how the war just needs to end, frozen conflict. The whole Hungary-Ukraine fight over the alleged spies in Zakarpattia is playing a part. Robert Fico from Slovakia was being feted in Moscow. I was seeming pretty happy over there in the company of Xi and Putin. So I don't know whether there'll be able to be a European consensus to get those sanctions on the ground quickly. I have a sense that there probably will be a new sanctions package being rolled out, but without the U.S. joining in full, its impact is quite limited. So maybe Britain might start unilaterally, the EU might come next, and then hopefully potentially the U.S.
Samuel, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Samuel Ramani there, author of Putin's War in Ukraine.